So thanks for coming tonight for the book launch for our new reader, The Internet Does Not Exist, which is available in the back for $15 a pop. Pick one up. The Internet Does Not Exist is a kind of, of course the title is it's a kind of a maybe poetic provocation, but it concedes that the internet, okay, like maybe there is something that we call an internet, but it doesn't any longer account for what it is actually doing to us, right? So if you want to take something like a materialist approach to the internet and explain it as a bundle of wires or a network of servers, it wants to say that actually what the internet is or what it has become can't be reduced to this anymore. What it is or what it does, actually it uses different kinds of fuel. It uses emotion. It uses blackmail. It uses different forms of extraction to mobilize you, to mobilize your attention, to mobilize your feeling, and to mobilize your friends, right? So the network is no longer something that we can imagine literally in a kind of old-fashioned sense, or in maybe a 90s sense, right? Or an 80s sense, right? It has become something else. So have a look at the book. I hope you like it. And it's a real pleasure to introduce 3 speakers tonight. Zach Bloss will be going first. Alexander Galloway will go second. And we'll be finishing with Karen Archie. And actually, you should wish Karen a big happy birthday because it's her 30th birthday at midnight tonight. And on the occasion of her birthday, on the occasion of her 30th birthday, the speakers will try to limit their talks to 30 minutes. We'll see how that goes. And after Karen finishes, we'll do a short Q&A with all the speakers at the end, and we can take questions from the audience then. I'm not going to read bios because at least 2 of our 3 speakers don't want their bios read, so I will simply turn it over to Zach Bloss. Let's give a warm welcome to him. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. So I'm going to talk through this project that I've just started called the Contra Internet, which is kind of a mixture at this point of theoretical research and artistic practice. So I'd like to begin this talk that I'm giving tonight by going through a series of examples where the internet ceases to exist, in a sense, which is when governments shut down internet access in times of political uprisings, revolts, and revolutions, and people cannot gain access to its infrastructure. So take, for instance, in Myanmar in 2007, during the Saffron Revolution, the internet access was blocked by officials. And again, in Egypt, during the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011, then President Hosni Mubarak and the Egyptian government terminated access to the internet in that country, what became known as flipping the internet kill switch. And again, in Istanbul, in 2014, in the aftermath of the Gezi protests, the Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan bans access to Twitter in an attempt to prevent corruption scandal due to incriminating materials that had leaked to the Twitter social media network. And noticeably, these instances of internet shutdowns have been accompanied by similar actions in Iraq and Nepal, and in North Korea, citizens have little to no access to the internet. Additionally, site filtering and censorship regularly occurs in China and many European countries. And here in the US, the internet might not be shut down, but has instead become a refined crystallization and extension of our extremist surveillance state. So my initial question, beginning with these examples of internet shutdowns and blockages, is if we start from these events, what do they tell us about the historical present? Where are we now with the internet? And perhaps an initial observation here is that unlike Marshall McLuhan's insistence on media as an extension of man, with perhaps the internet being the perfect example of this, the internet has now become more of an extension of governance and control. So during the same time period as these increased internet shutdowns and disconnections, 2 concepts have gained immense popularity in thinking and conceptualizing our present era of digital networks, and these are the post-digital and the post-internet. So these ideas gesture towards marking the historical present as that which exists within a kind of totalized sphere of the digital and the internet. Now, of course, these terms are very heavily debated. I'm not going to get into that tonight, but what we can really kind of extract from each of these concepts is that they suggest that the digital is everywhere and the internet is everywhere, in the sense that whether culture, art, various kinds of cultural production have been, if they're online or offline, if they're digital or not digital, they have been touched and affected by the digital and by the internet. So of course, these concepts emerge from a theoretical postal malaise today. And we have to think of these ideas of the post-digital and the post-internet as symptomatic of a larger theoretical trend today that attempts to think the contemporary by using post. And right, so what is the mode of production? It's post-Fordism. What are politics? Post-politics. What is media? It's post-media. It's post-digital. What's happened to identity politics? Well, now we're post-feminist, post-queer, post-race. And even a few weeks ago at the New Museum, I encountered the term post-critical, whatever that means. So what this suggests is that there's an obsession to use post to think the contemporary, but post signals an inability to think the contemporary in its singularity. So if we return to the post-digital and the post-internet, these terms become like bottlenecks where life, culture, and politics must pass through, right? So this is the idea that, again, whether it's digital, whether it's online, right, it must filter through the bottleneck of the digital, filter through the bottleneck of the internet, and come out on the other side. But my question is, what if the internet is turned off and life, culture, and politics can't pass through that bottleneck? Or what if life, culture, politics, and art do not want to pass through? What if they refuse to pass through the bottleneck of the internet and the digital? So out of this theoretical vortex of postisms, a definition of the internet emerges. And this is a definition that by far exceeds its technical infrastructure and marks something more like an ascending way of thinking about a totalized social and cultural condition. So in short, just as capitalism has been theorized in the past, we could say that the internet has come to stand as a totality. But of course, it is not that. And right, people in the past have suggested perhaps that the internet is already dead, and maybe the internet died from one too many flips of the kill switch, or perhaps the internet is now just a substitution or a puppet for a much larger sociocultural condition. But there are indeed actions and events that fracture this supposed totality of the internet, and they are both the governmental shutdowns as well as emerging militant refusals to engage with the internet. So tonight my goal is to move this idea of the internet right, through a series of discursive transformations in order to locate the potentialities of a militant alternative or an outside to the totality of the internet, to the totality that the internet has seemed to become. So, and a personal note here, I'll work through a queer and feminist framework here because I'm personally really committed to working with queer and feminist politics and bridging them to engage with issues of the digital and networks. Okay, so the first transformation I want to talk about is, it comes from the writings of J.K. Gibson Graham, two feminist theorists that write under the same name. J.K. Gibson Graham's idea of post-capitalist politics. And this idea of post-capitalist politics does not mean what comes after the totality of capitalism, but in fact it means the opposite. It means the alternatives that actually already are in existence within the supposed totality of capitalism itself. And of course, within various strands of continental political thought and Marxism, capitalism is quite frequently theorized as a totality with no outside. So J.K. Gibson Graham are making an intervention here and very directly declaring that there are outsides and alternatives to capitalism. And this is what post-capitalist means for them. So I'm interested first in funneling post-internet through post-capitalist, which perhaps is to redefine post-internet or possibly just read it against itself a little bit. And then once you filter post-internet through post-capitalist, what you get is post-internet means the alternatives at play and in existence within the supposedly totalized frame or network that constitutes, right, the internet. So, and these alternatives could be things like autonomous mesh networks or encryption practices, which I'll talk about soon. And J.K. Gibson Graham discussed this as a shift from totality to possibility. And they use the term capitalocentric to kind of charge this obsession with thinking about capitalism as only a totality. So again, internetocentric might be a useful term that insists on a position that is unable to think beyond or outside of the internet. Okay, so the second transformation comes from the writings of Paul B. Preciado, particularly from his Contrasexual Manifesto. And the move from post, which is one of articulating alternatives, to contra is a militant one. And within Preciado's writings, particularly this Contrasexual Manifesto, the contrasexual is at once a refusal of sexual norms and naturalization. So the sexual is never something that emerges from any kind of naturalized place. It is also the perverse constitution of contra pleasures in the body, as well as the evocation of a utopian horizon of political transformation. So again, if we push the internet through Preciado's idea of the contrasexual and come out the other side, then we might begin to define the contra-internet as refusals of the internet and constitutions of network alternatives through things like subversion, transgression, or inversion. So Preciado does this through what he calls dildo tectonics. And dildo tectonics for Preciado is the prized science of contrasexuality. So for Preciado, the dildo is an externality that undoes any assumptions about the body as a totalized heterosexual unity. So in fact, as you see in this image here, the body can actually be entirely mapped out as a dildo, which means the body can be transformed into pure contrasexuality. So just a note here that for Preciado, the dildo does not equal a phallus. So the dildo comes before. So right, Preciado might say a penis is a meat dildo, but a dildo is not a plastic penis. So Preciado outlines a series of dildo tectonic exercises to practically experiment with contrasexuality. And one of these involves drawing a dildo on your forearm to try and activate contrasexual potentiality in the body. So I tried this exercise actually a few times, and the first time I did it was in Istanbul over the summer. And we kind of took this lone masturbatory exercise and transformed it into something like a contrasexual masturbatory orgy. And as you can see, we had quite a good time doing this. But then this workshop, this activity, led us to the question, well, what are the dildo tectonics of the internet? And perhaps a way to begin to answer this is to untangle the relation or the collapsing of internet and network. Whereas the internet can be understood as being comprised of networks, but a network is not an internet. So in kind of a sloppy way of first trying to make this move from dildo tectonics, I'm left with net tectonics. And the first, I guess you could say, practice in this contrasexual repertoire would be utopian plagiarism, which is something I've been doing all along through this talk, which is actually working through certain discursive traditions and substituting ideas in to see what might emerge or what might shift. And this is an idea, a tactic that was originally developed by Critical Art Ensemble in the early 90s. So first I'm going to show you a video that's this, that actualizes this utopian plagiarism with the works of J.K. Gibson Graham, Preciado, Latigre, and some others.
It feels so 80s. e-flux contra-internet? It seems to be easier for us today to imagine the thoroughgoing deterioration of the earth and of nature than the breakdown of late internet. Perhaps that is due to some weakness in our imaginations. Understanding internet has always been a project of the left, especially within the Marxian tradition. Given the avowed servitude of left theory to left political action, it is ironic, though not surprising, that understandings and images of internet can quite readily be viewed as contributing to a crisis in left politics. The end of internet, as we knew it, problematizes internet as a network and social descriptor. The book selectively traces the discursive origins of a widespread understanding that internet is the hegemonic, or even the only, present form of network and that it will continue to be so in the proximate future. It follows from this prevalent though not ubiquitous view that contra-internet network sites, if they exist at all, must inhabit the social margins, and, as a corollary, that deliberate attempts to develop contra-internet network practices and institutions must take place in the social interstices, in the realm of experiment, or in a visionary space of revolutionary social replacement. Depictions of internet hegemony deserve a particularly skeptical reading. Just as man is the universal subject and species standard of phallocentric discourse, internet is positioned as the network standard in the discourses I have called internetocentric. The very idea of a contra-internet network takes the shape of an unlikelihood or even an impossibility. It becomes difficult to entertain a vision of the prevalence and vitality of contra-internet network forms, or of daily or partial replacements of internet by contra-internet network practices, or of internet retreats and reversals. In this sense, internet hegemony operates not only as a constituent of, but also as a brake upon, the contra-internet imagination. What difference might it make to release that brake and allow an contra-internet network imaginary to develop unrestricted? If we were to dissolve the image that looms in the network foreground, what shadowy network forms might come forward? In these questions we can identify the broad outlines of our project, to discover or create a world of network difference, and to populate that world with exotic creatures that become, upon inspection, quite local and familiar, not to mention familiar beings that are not what they seem. In our dreams we have seen another network, an honest network, a network decidedly more fair than the one in which we now live.
Okay, so perhaps another tactic within net tectonics would be social media exodus. And social media exodus could be understood as an engaged withdrawal from the corporate monoculture of social media. And importantly, this is not a privileged gesture, but one that refuses the neoliberalization of networked relationality. So social media exodus would be a retraining of our subjectivity away from the brute reduction of friendship to the tweet, the like, the friend request, the icon, and the avatar, and the co-optation of such networks by governments and surveillance agents. A social media exodus could indeed lead us to a needed disidentification with these networks. I don't recognize myself. Political subjectivity emerges precisely when the subject does not recognize itself in its representation. It is fundamental not to recognize oneself. De-recognition, disidentification, is a condition for the emergence of the political as the possibility of transforming reality, a kind of experiment that doesn't have faith in representation as an exteriority that will bring truth or happiness. So I'd like to end with a different kind of example of the internet ceasing to exist. So in Hong Kong, during the pro-democracy protests in 2014, amidst fears that the Chinese government would possibly cut off the internet, disable cell phone networks, protesters began utilizing FireChat, which is a mesh networking device for cell phones that would enable protesters to share information and connect without having a cell phone network signal or Wi-Fi. So on your phone, all you would need is an ability to use Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. And the way that these mesh networks operate is that information then gets passed node from node based on proximity. So this application, FireChat, would work if you were at least no further than 400 feet away from another person. So when you're in a closed, really compact group of people, information is able to travel through these mesh networks quite far. And even though these mesh networks have their problems, they're quite robust and difficult to take down. So what this illustrates, this example in Hong Kong, is that these protesters were able to digitally network without the internet. And of course, this example is not isolated. Mesh networking, for various political reasons, has occurred in New York during Occupy, in Detroit, Taiwan, and Iraq. And these examples of mesh networks illustrate a kind of network militancy in that they at once point toward the inadequacies of the internet when engaging with political change, but they also give us a glimmer, perhaps utopian, of another kind of network that could be. In fact, they present to us quite stunningly the end of the internet as we knew it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, it's hard to go after Latigra, but we'll see what we can do here. Okay, so thanks to Brian for setting this up, and e-flux, and all of you for coming. It's fun to be here speaking. Zach and I have been having a kind of ongoing conversation for a couple of years now, and it's also nice to be here with Karen. I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of issues that I think come up in the book, and say a little bit about this theme, talk a little bit about aesthetics and politics. And I'll do that maybe kind of informally working through a series of kind of statements or propositions or something. And so we'll see how far we get. So I think one of the things I've been trying to grapple with in recent years is trying to understand why such a maybe a kind of monochromatic or smooth or consistent style has emerged out of a technical infrastructure that's based on radical heterogeneity, complexity, difference, a kind of chaotic infrastructure, a multipolar infrastructure. And it struck me recently that we might actually today be living through a kind of a new version of what in architectural circles was called the international style. I think we might be living today through a new kind of international style that's not just limited to architecture. And so what is this style all about? Well, I think it has to do with this curious way, as I said, of trying to leverage kind of chaotic, contingent, precarious phenomena of heterogeneity, even the kind of like mesh stuff that Zach was talking about at the end. Or even in the language of, in a kind of more political language, the notion of a multitude, right, or a rhizomatic structure. I'm an old rhizome veteran, but I'm going to say maybe some mean things about the concept of the rhizome tonight. So, because on the one hand, we have the multitude described as a kind of rhizomatic structure, but then if you read the definition of empire, it's also a rhizomatic structure. So this is what I mean when I say that there's a kind of consistency or smoothness in the set of available options, aesthetic political options. So I think this is the magic, you might say, of this new international style, is that it kind of galvanizes this monoculture out of this infrastructure that's incredibly chaotic, multipolar, and so on. So I've been, proposing a concept to understand this, which is the concept of protocol, which is borrowed from computer science. Well, originally it's borrowed from, I guess, international relations, but I borrowed it from computer science as a way to talk about universal standards that are not about eliminating, chance events and deviations and so on, but quite the opposite, about facilitating and allowing chance events and deviations, but at the same time maybe managing them or administering them. Now, I'll say before moving on that this has put me at odds a little bit with some of the trends in current discourse in critical theory, because in fact, you still do see a lot of people who speak about power in terms of a lot of the classic categories. So things like verticality, right? Centralization, pyramid-shaped structures, citadels, towers, cathedrals. These are some of the terms and metaphors that are used. Contra that, then, resistance always looks like a rhizome. It looks like an assemblage. It looks like a multiplicity, something of that in that vein. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. The second one is that I think that thinking about this stylistic consistency, and maybe even trying to contextualize a little bit more in terms of the larger political, maybe even economic context, I think we can say today, hopefully this won't be too controversial, but I think that art today is fairly disconnected from the legacy of the historical avant-garde. And maybe to put it in sharper terms, I think we could say that if art used to, at least maybe under modernism or something like that, if art used to think of itself as a kind of vanguard, I think now art is more often the caboose, if you will, right? A kind of ambulance chaser, at least in terms of its ability to think the new or to experiment in different ways. One way to do this is just to take a kind of, candid survey of some of the different exhibitions and shows that, or various trends that we see. So, financialization and debt during Occupy and during the crisis years. We've all seen or participated in various shows on network art, Occupy art, speculation as a theme, or even today, object-oriented, accelerationist or new materialist themes. And so this struck me as very interesting. These are all notions, concepts, themes that, as far as I can tell, are more or less borrowed from other sectors. So this strikes me as very interesting. And I wonder, in fact, I don't know, not to glamorize a kind of late 90s moment, but I do think that initial moment in which web and internet technologies were used in art making really is a kind of modernist phase. And I think in retrospect, people were saying this at the time, but I think in retrospect it's now very clear that this can be understood as a kind of modernist phase, followed by what certainly, and I think Zach's commentary about this prefix post is right on the money, that that this kind of modernist phase was predictably followed by something that is much more postmodernist in its orientation, right? A use of a kind of hyper-real pastiche style. I still haven't figured out how irony works in post-internet aesthetics, because it seems like, I thought like after the new sincerity, irony was gone, but then it seems like it's not gone. So I don't know, maybe other people have more enlightening things to say about that. So that's the second point. The third one is that I think we need to do better to historicize Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. And so I'll just say two things that maybe even just by way of provocation, because I think there's a kind of like historical law or set of historical laws we can follow here. So the first one is that I think Web 2.0 was historically inevitable. In other words, once the first kind of web revolution happened, if you want to call it that, you could have, at that moment, just started your stopwatch and said, OK, we're waiting until this kind of echo event happens. So Web 2.0 was historically inevitable. It's the first point. And the second one is there will be no Web 3.0. In other words, thinking historically, there's always ever two revolutions or two moments in a revolutionary event, right? There's a kind of, and you can even think about this historically, right? Like in 1917, you have the events in the springtime, the bourgeoisie rising up against the Tsar. But that was followed, of course, in the fall, in October, with the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, rising up against the bourgeoisie. So you could think about it in very different contexts. The Summer of Love, followed by 1973 or 1974, and the kind of economic revolution and crisis connected with those years. And a lot of other people have talked about this, but it's the notion that whenever there's a revolution or a kind of dramatic turn of events, it has to have a kind of initiation moment and then a kind of subsequent moment. And I like to think about this in terms of a kind of conceptual break followed by a material break, right? So the conceptual break would be the revolutionary break in which change is driven by the concept and a kind of, if you will, forcing of the world vis-a-vis a concept. So in 1994 or whatever, that could have been radical horizontality or something could have been the concept. Followed by a subsequent kind of echo event, which, not to be too pessimistic, but is really one about sort of recuperation, monetization, oftentimes. It doesn't have to be, but I think certainly Web 2.0 bears some of those traits. Okay, so that second event is the one that I think is most interesting. And in fact, it's the hardest one, and it's the riskiest one. Every February must have its October. And there's no guarantee that the October will be successful. And in fact, a lot of times it's very reactionary. Right? So this is maybe the fourth point I want to make, which is that this first revolution can be dangerous, but the second revolution, in being very risky, there's just a lot of chance to be led off track. It's the moment of counter-reformation, right? It's really oftentimes a conservative moment. It's a moment, I think, which is what kind of Zach was hinting at, a moment of proletarianization, right? Meaning the reduction of certain living arrangements and conventions, the reduction of those experiences, those lived experiences, into much more kind of rationalized activities. It's also oftentimes the moment of austerity. I said the moment of capitalization and monetization. Right? Think about the difference between like a first-generation web search company and then a Web 2.0 company. So I think this is part of the kind of the bizarre contradiction at the heart of the theme of this book, which I find really interesting. The internet does not exist, which is that it is, this kind of there's a kind of willful falsity or something embedded in this notion, right? Because it does still exist. It's just that it's been maybe kind of naturalized or veiled or hidden or mystified in some other way, right? So I find it, if that's the case, I find it sort of fun and challenging to try to think, well, what would it actually mean, truly, if the internet did not exist, right? So what would that actually mean? Well, okay, first of all, you'd have to unplug all the computers, right? Okay, well, that would be hard. But even if you did that, you haven't achieved it, right? Because we still would be grappling with the dynamics I talked about earlier about fleeing verticality toward horizontality, and all of these like larger historical transformations. So I think we have to think much more radically. I think we have to have a much, our goal has to be, a very different kind of a goal. So what would we have to do? Well, I think the first thing we have to do is we have to forget Deleuze. We have to forget the work of Deleuze, Deleuzianism, everything that Deleuze has come to stand for. And I say this as a kind of recovering Deleuzian. So I think that, to put it in very crass terms, and I don't think you can overstate the influence of Deleuze and then the kind of greater thing that he stands for on the contemporary situation. Incredibly influential. Now, thinking more historically, I think that maybe for a previous generation, Deleuze and Deleuzianism was essentially the solution, right? Like if you wanted to fight the man, you got in a grassroots movement, right? A rhizomatic movement. I think today, Deleuzianism is essentially the problem. And so two things that we might want to, two ways to maybe forget Deleuze. I think the first thing we need to do is we need to forget the Google Deleuzians. So who are the Google Deleuzians? Well, so these are the people who kind of proselytize systematicity, openness, the open, dynamic, robust nature of networks, right? Clouds and humans and mollusks and molecules are all systems, are all networks. Right? The Google Deleuzians are the ones who describe everything in terms of a vital assemblage. And this is an assemblage, of course, that's described in that way because it proffers untold bounties of knowledge, maybe, value, certainly wealth. So that's the first thing we need to do. I think we need to forget the Google Deleuzians. But maybe more importantly, I think we need to forget what you might want to call the wet diaper Deleuzians. So who are they? Well, these, I think, are the people in a kind of endless restaging of the 60s, think that being political means liberating one's desires. So for the wet diaper Deleuzians, everything is a desiring machine. Everything is driven by a kind of endless reserve of polymorphous perversity. The wet diaper Deleuzians giggle and cry, suckle and shit, fall down and get back up. The world is a giant sandbox filled with toys. And for the wet diaper Deleuzians, everyone they meet is a potential father, a potential master, someone who might threaten their desire, someone to be dethroned, debased, even killed. And each act becomes a dollhouse revolution, off with their heads. So this, again, I want to be very careful about how we talk about this because it has to be periodized and put in a historical context. Because certainly, as I said, maybe for a previous moment or a previous generation, this would be certainly at the very center of what, a progressive theoretical or social project would be all about, I think. And maybe in certain ways still today, in fact. But I think there's a major problem here, which is that this is also Facebook's entire business plan. And so that to me is a kind of, a kind of bottleneck, to use Zach's term, that we really need to kind of face up to. It doesn't mean that I may be overstating it. It doesn't mean we have to never think in this way again. But certainly, I think the honeymoon period is over. Maybe is the best way to put it. And I think this is a kind of litmus test too today for people on the left, right? Like, is the goal of X author the liberation of desire, or is it something else? Is it something like like social justice, maybe? Manuel de Landa, liberation of desire. Michelle Alexander, social justice. Right, two very different ways of thinking about what it means to be progressive today. Okay, so that was the fifth point. Sixth point. I think because of all of this isn't new, right? And I think everyone is sort of intuitively has a sense of some of the things I've been talking about. And I think this is why we're seeing today a kind of increase in things like cynicism, just senses of discouragement, this desire for maybe a social media exodus, a resurgence in kind of dystopian thinking, even. And I love, Deleuze and Guattari, bless their heart, in 1980 said, we're tired of trees. But I think today, people kind of want to have the trees back, maybe sometimes, right? And certainly we need the trees to combat global warming, that's for sure. So we're seeing the return of pessimism as an important issue in everything from philosophy and theory to popular culture. So in something like True Detective, in philosophy and theory, the work of Frank Wilderson on Afro-pessimism. It's maybe not called this so much, but even we could talk about the notion of a kind of queer pessimism, the idea of, even around like the critique of reproductive futurity. Eugene Thacker has written a new book on pessimism in the context of philosophy. I'm also thinking of Nicola Masciandaro's work on, what does he call it, the sorrow of being. And he's also written on this notion in theology of the crucifixion darkness, right? Like the cosmos grew dark. And some of you, I'm sure, have also followed the theme of extinction that's starting to come up in eco-philosophy and post-humanist discourse as well. I think there's a kind of connection between all those things. And out of this sense of cynicism, discouragement, whatever you want to call it, I think we're seeing, in fact, a whole new, it's not really a moment of I don't know, throwing in the towel or something, because we're seeing a whole new flock of weird creatures, weird ontologies, things that don't simply take the archetype of the distributed network or the internet and kind of cut and paste it into other areas, right? So I think actually even here at e-flux, some of you might have remembered Stephen Shaviro's talk, and he's been working on this concept of panpsychism, which has some interesting potential, I think. Or perhaps even in Eugene's work, Afterlife, where he talks about the idea of divine negation. He talks about this notion of a luminous void, or maybe I think the most evocative concept in that book is what he calls the uncreature, right? The uncreature, which maybe in the future might play, I don't know, maybe a similar role in this conversation that a concept like the cyborg played, let's say in the late 1980s and 1990s. Or even I'm thinking of Jordana Rosenberg's work, the notion of queer communism as a response to maybe a kind of less appealing, in her view, currents in contemporary critical theory, queer or otherwise. Along with these kind of weird creatures, there's also, this interest in weird machines. Zach has explored this idea of a queer computer language, which I find really interesting. And I know that other people have experimented with the idea of a feminist computer language, right? Like, what would that even look like? I worked on a language called the LCL that is just it's a very simple spec, but was also trying to devise a computer language that didn't fall into the structure, right? That basically every algorithm has ever fallen into from the history of from the whole history. It's an incredibly monochromatic history. I'm thinking also of Geert Lovink's work on, I love this, what he calls not working, right? Instead of networking, not working. Or even just like, why can't we start thinking about alternative algorithms, right? Like, why that should really be a space, I think. Algorithms are dominated by efficiency, expediency, abstraction, right? This whole kind of cluster of things that people in art and progressive movements have always shied away from. So why are we using these tools that are structured in this way? And a lot of these have already been built, right? So something like Tor as a kind of we could call it a kind of anti-identificatory infrastructure or something, maybe even anti-subjective even. Even something like BitTorrent as a, as a kind of like undead capacity to it, which I find really interesting, right? Like the objects will not die, right? They will in fact proliferate in interesting ways. And at the same time, I think that recognizing the political potential of a whole different set of virtues, things like darkness and compression, or opacity, the concept of the generic or the indiscernible, as opposed to those stalwart liberal virtues, which are all the opposite, right? Enlightenment, expression rather than compression, illumination rather than opacity. So those are some of the things that I know people are starting to think about today. So just to end, I think this is really what the theme has kind of sparked in my own mind, my own thinking. I'm really interested in moments when thinking about this theme of the internet does not exist, right? That when disavowal of repetition persists itself as repetition, right? When you say something isn't going to happen, but then in fact it does happen, and that to me is those are very revealing moments, and in fact that's a kind of logic that sovereignty and the state, even ideology, it's a kind of logic that's just a classic aspect of how ideology works, right? And so out of this, I think, and this might be just naively utopian or Pollyannish of me to say this, but I think that we do have to rethink what it would mean to have a true break, right? A true form of inexistence that isn't just another form of repetition. So last, I'm just, because the weather was really crappy today, but we are celebrating springtime. So in order to kind of wrap this series of ideas, I just want to read a short little, it's not really a poem, but a kind of passage by the poet Brady Cardia, just called Springtime, because I think it connects a lot of these ideas together, and you might like it. Okay, so here it is. I wonder why chickens and dogs, when they give birth to little chickens and dogs. The same, only smaller. What a folly of biology. Would the cosmos not be more perfect if orangutans spawned from eagles' nests or a woman leaped from a rib? A soft fascism, this kingdom, which obligates redundancy from its progeny. Am I trapped by this body? Am I not shackled all the more by this phylogeny? Each birth is a miracle, but no birth is a revelation. Why not blue babies from green mothers? Or better, from fathers? Why not slim stuffs from slime mold? What came first, the chicken or the egg? Both, of course. Therein lies the problem. Hiding in the family tree of the chicken, no snake lurks in anticipation to swallow it up. The horseless carriage springs not from the horse. Only eggs and chickens all the way back. The ancients knew about metamorphosis, but we moderns have lost all that. We have nothing but that most impoverished of concepts, change. We have no alchemy in our progeny. Our reward instead is that flux rules supreme across the land of the living. Things evolve in perpetual motion, but never in metamorphosis. Springtime is no departure, only a return. The lust of the flesh intervenes, only to shake the species backward toward a primordial sameness. Fuck, O holy spring, ransack the houses and cupboards, disencumber the sire of his possessions. Don't recognize the output of this profane mega-machine. Find more holes, please, and find them quickly. We desperately need evil children. Let them live and love and prosper and fight. Thanks.
Thanks so much to Brian and e-flux for having me. I just wanted to say that it's really funny to give this talk in light of the title of the book, because this talk is all about the materiality of the internet and how it can actually have a biophysical resonation and impact on the body. And I wanted to say that I began a lot of this research while I was organizing the exhibition Art Post-Internet at Olin Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing. And I found a surprising lack of work about gender and sexuality. And like, if you think, for example, like how ubiquitous online pornography is, for example, there's such little art made about it. So a little bit of this research will go into sexuality and also identification processes and so on and so forth. And also this essay is going to be published in the volume titled Mass Effect, Art in the Internet in the 21st Century, which is edited by Lauren Cornell and Ed Halter, and published by the New Museum and MIT Press. So that'll come out in, I think, September as part of their Documents in Contemporary Art series. One of the most dramatic developments in the nature of social interaction since the advent of the internet is the emancipation of our identities and sexual lives from the body and so-called meat space interaction. We're no longer bound to our bodies and the social encryptions that they carry while we socialize, and we no longer must seek out sexual or romantic partners in physical spaces dedicated to such. We can see the effects of this emancipation from our physical nature, perhaps most clearly in hookup culture. While geographic cruising zones still exist, bars, parks, and the like, they're no longer the only way in which we find partners. These sites have streamlined such encounters via searchable terms like uncut, drug and disease-free, 420 friendly, for example, while Craigslist and later smartphone applications such as Tinder and Grindr are but three obvious meeting points for no-strings-attached sex. Other web platforms such as Tumblr and YouTube have become hosts to lesser-known communities of sexual fetishists. These fetishes, oftentimes extremely strange to the heteronormative orthodox and sometimes quite niche, are amplified by the privacy of and supported by the blank slate of the internet. Fetishes range from just about anything to just about anything. Furries, wet clothes, celebrity feet, and so on and so forth. The tendency to make fetishistic porn out of everything is so pervasive online that the notorious 4chan random message board B wrote in their rules of the internet that, for example, number 34, if it exists, there is porn out of it. Number 35, if no porn is found of it, it will be created. And number 36, no matter what it is somebody's fetish. No exceptions. The videos of Glasgow-based Charlotte Prodger track this march from the geographic cruising zone online to the online fetish community. She rips footage from a YouTube account that records ritualistic acts imposed upon collectible Nike sneakers. Prodger's videos are overlaid with both audio recitations of comments received by the YouTube user, who goes by the very apropos Nike Classics, as well as queer diaristic passages chosen by the artist. In one video, we see only the torso and legs of a young man as he dissects collectible sneakers, cutting them in half and ripping off layers of leather. In another video, two young men in track pants exchange their sneakers back and forth. As the men continue to occupy each other's respective negative spaces with their feet, these actions become an analog for sex. It is apparent that the viewing, in addition to the production of these videos, are sexually enticing for some, and even constitutes a supportive community of video producers and viewers. This is evidenced by a comment left on Nike Classics video by the YouTube user Wet Rev, who I think goes by Wet Reverend, apparently a wet clothes fetishist. Should play in the mud or water in those Nikes and trackies too, squash each other's Nikes into the water. The artist Laurie Simmons is largely known for her photographs of dolls and the cultural assumptions about femininity and domesticity that we project onto them. And her most recent work tracks the advent of the dollar cosplay subculture. Here's where things get a little weird if you don't know what, if you're unfamiliar with the rabbit hole of cosplay, it's a portmanteau of costume play. The Japanese term kigurumi describes a person dressed in a full-body costume of a cartoon character or animal. Dollars wear latex kigurumi masks, emulating female anime characters. To be a proper dollar, you must wear a kigurumi doll mask with a full-body latex suit in order to adequately mirror the matte quality of a cartoon character's skin. Simmons purchased several kigurumi masks intricately painted by an artist in Russia and cast models to wear them, latex suit and all, in variably sexualized poses. One photo captures a dollar wearing heels, pink thigh-high socks, and a mini skirt while tugging down a pink shirt and gazing into the camera. Another depicts a blonde dollar holding in a bathtub a skeptical-looking dog, while another shows a darker-skinned kigurumi taking a selfie. Given our growing predilection for finding sex and love online, and the increasingly niche forms that sexuality has taken since fetishes have become indexable and searchable, Simmons' interest in such online subcultures seems like a prescient front. Those at odds with the culturally determined ideas about normativity once sought to alleviate their frustrations in physical spaces, the cruising park. Simmons' photographs reiterate the weirdly beautiful agency in such subcultures and the tragedy of the respective cultural conditions that precipitated them. Performance artist Anna Hirsch looks not to fetish subcultures, but to the early days of the web, circa 1998, where conversing with strangers was the rule, not the exception. Her piece Playground in 2013 is a play between two characters, Annie, who is mostly autobiographical and based on a plucky 12-year-old Hirsch, and Job, a 27-year-old hacker who has a penchant for chatting up preteens online. The play begins with Annie and Job sitting at their respective chipboard desktop workstations, enraptured by the chat playing out on their respective chunky monitors, a nostalgic mise-en-scène for anyone born pre-Y2K. Their conversation, projected behind them for the audience to read, revolves around their chosen chat room politics and quickly takes on a creepy tone, with Job asking Annie to be his online girlfriend. This honorific comes with the probing sexual questions in a masturbation coaching session through the telephone, with Annie lying and hilariously faking orgasm. Job says, "Did you come, Annie?" Annie says, "Yes, did you?" Job says, "Yes, I came for you." Annie says, "Me too." Job says, "You did so good, Annie. I'm so proud of you." Annie says, "Me too. I'm proud of me too." Job says, "Are you being facetious with me?" Annie says, "No." "Well, I don't know. What's facetious?" Annie and Job waver between breaking up and getting back together. Annie begins to doubt Job after he asks her to pick a pen up her vagina and send it to him in the mail. His next desperate last-ditch request for soiled underwear prompted Hirsch to formally dump Job. After a brief break, they get back together, hugging and declaring their eternal love for each other as the play ends. While Hirsch's play represents an obvious case of sexual abuse to the audience, such is not the case with Annie herself, who desired a romantic relationship and was unwittingly manipulated by an older man. The play importantly casts light on those early, yet-to-be-processed days in which we are still getting to know the internet and how many men and women had their first romantic and sexual experiences online. Slightly younger than Hirsch is the artist Bunny Rogers, who came of age in a time when both television and the web capitalized on programs and websites for kids. She was notably very, very into television. Like many digital natives, hers is an identity formed amid the blooming mass media of the early 2000s. It could be argued that those who grew up since this era experienced identification processes via both television and computer screens, which introduce increasingly more remote content with which a child may uncannily identify with. This is compared to, my mother and father who had, maybe like 1 or 2 television stations total. Take, for example, a cartoon version of Joan of Arc. Rogers has illustrated this phenomenon of elastic identity via her various self-portraits as inanimate and often lugubrious objects. A mop dyed purple and festooned with ribbon. This one, which is titled Self-Portrait Morning Mop and is from 2013. Or a handmade ceramic urn with the image of a cat on its front, which is titled Self-Portrait Cat Urn and is also from 2013. Rogers seems to have a penchant for all things goth, both the mass-produced hot topic and seriously antisocial varieties. For a recent body of work titled Columbine Library, shown at Societe in Berlin in the summer of 2014, Rogers took inspiration from the 1999 Columbine High School massacre, using 2 mainstream goth cartoon characters as stand-ins for the shooters' identities. Joan of Arc of Clone High representing Dylan Klebold, and Gaz of Invader Zim representing Eric Harris. That Rogers assigns these twee goth cartoon characters as avatars for the seriously deranged shooters is another exercise in such elasticity of identification. This one specifically speaking to a personally felt sense of social alienation that vacillates between the pop and the psychotic. Rogers is not alone in identifying with Klebold and Harris either, as we see countless online communities dedicated to them and other unlikely heroes. There are a lot of really interesting images that I found for this PowerPoint. One may wonder how it's possible to both forget the cruelty of the shooters and to depersonalize the victims of the Columbine massacre to such an extent that entire communities valorize its perpetrators. To better understand the collective identification with the shooters, let's consider Laura Mulvey's take on active scopophilia in cinema within her landmark 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, and recontextualize it for the web. She writes, and sorry to Mulvey you guys, but it really works for this talk. So, the massive mainstream film portrays a hermetically sealed world which unwinds magically, producing for the audience a sense of separation and playing on their voyeuristic fantasy. Moreover, the extreme contrast between the darkness in the auditorium, which also isolates the spectators from one another, and the brilliance of the shifting patterns of light and shade on the screen, helps to promote the illusion of voyeuristic separation. These conditions giving the spectator an illusion of looking in on a private world. Think about the subject of this passage not in a theater, but sitting at their private desk, staring into the alternate world of Facebook, a chat room, Tumblr, or a role-playing game. Mulvey says, scopophilic pleasurable structures must be attached to an idealization and pursue aims in indifference to perceptual reality, creating an imagized, eroticized concept of the world that forms a perception of the subject and makes a mockery of empirical objectivity. That is to say, the physical separation of the body from the screen begets a psychological separation between the ego and the screen subject, allowing the ego's ideal version of the world to manifest, leading to this seeming break with reality. Yet, given the somewhat active rather than passive nature of online participation, this world can be further reaffirmed and constructed via involvement in online echo chambers, such as Google-indexed online communities, such as men's rights forums, which Californian mass shooter Elliot Rodger frequented, or role-playing games, or even Facebook. Take into consideration the algorithmic edge-rank system that Facebook employs in determining which posts show up in a user's feed. Here's the basic version. The more frequently user A clicks on or comments on user B's posts, the more user A will see posted information by user B. Further, should user A have an abundance of friends, all creating edges with user C, the more user A and associated users will see user C's posts. Thus, through click tracking, Facebook effectively creates an ecosystem tailored to whatever and whoever incites the user's feelings most ardently, including and not including peripheral voices based on their proclivity to manipulate the system. One need only to look at the World of Warcraft to witness an idealized world created via the egos of its players. World of Warcraft is an extremely successful, massively multiplayer online role-playing game, or MPORG, that celebrated its 10th birthday in November 2014. According to Wikipedia, World of Warcraft has grossed over $10 billion as of July 2012, with over 100 million accounts registered over its lifetime. Its users, who pay a monthly subscription fee to play, are also predominantly male. The artist Angela Washko, who has been playing World of Warcraft since 2006, quickly noticed rampant misogyny, heightened male-gendered language, and a lack of female players. Males sometimes even play female characters. In early 2012, Washko founded the Council on Gender Sensitivity and Behavioral Awareness in the World of Warcraft as an intervention within the game. As part of this intervention, Washko approaches various characters and asks, via the game's chat function, what he or she thinks of the term feminism, which she then screen records and captures and uploads to her Tumblr. She also asks players about their professional and economic backgrounds, which are surprisingly disparate. I thought that these were all going to be like, teenage mouth breathers, but they're not. The artist has spoken to the unemployed, pregnant teens, doctors, lawyers, paraplegics, your usual angsty kid, and so on. As most participants are earnestly interested, Washko's project surveys a likely more diverse pool than, say, an art world panel on feminism. She, of course, gets quite a few off-color comments. Upon asking a male person why he was playing a female character, he said, "I'd rather stare at a girl's ass all day than a guy's," as if it were inherently gay to play a male character. Again, channeling Mulvey, Washko noted to me in a recent conversation that this is a classic fantasy of the ideal female projected into the female on the screen. When asked why this misogynistic behavior was so rampant online, unanswerable question, Washko replied to me that she thought that because there's no body-to-body public accountability in online space, such communities act as a moral-free safe zone through which we can act out our base desires with no consequences. In other words, it's a playground for scopophilia. This is kind of a just riffing part of the talk that, we'll see how it goes. Now that we've spoken about the sexual othering of the female subject, I'd like to pose a series of questions about the forever fraught topic of female self-portraiture to the room. Please keep in mind this is a somewhat difficult subject, and much of the terminology I'm about to use is deeply problematic. And the effects I'm speaking about are really unquantifiable, but also collectively keenly felt. And I think that in private conversations, I've been talking about this a lot with a lot of colleagues, but I haven't written about it, so on and so forth. So let me start with a couple quotes. In a recent Facebook conversation, the artist and writer Mira Shore wrote, "Unfortunately, in a patriarchal society," okay, let me back up for a second. I was noticing tons and tons of young women using images of themselves online as part of a practice that was between artwork and between a kind of like social media performance. And so that was kind of affecting a female online community of artists that I'm in conversation with. And so this is kind of some investigation that I've been doing into this phenomenon. In a recent Facebook conversation, the artist and writer Mira Shore wrote, "Unfortunately, in a patriarchal society where women are from childhood focused on their body rather than the world, it is all too tempting and it makes total sense to use one's body in one's art. It is all one is really interested in about you. The brain of the woman artist is generally not respected except within the most refined cadres of academia. Your body is often your principal asset and your biggest problem, psychically and psychologically. It's your subject matter and material. I'm not saying this from an essentialist point of view, but from a realist point of view. And let's face it, you get a lot of attention for it, whether via controversy or not. It doesn't matter. In fact, au contraire, controversy is good." This kind of sums up the problem that I'm referring to. When we introduce sexuality to art, it can become a criteria for judgment. Now to stumble through some questions. Is the representation of the female body in art always subject to objectification? Can a female body ever truly subvert the male gaze? And again, these are like age-old problematic questions. If we look back to second-wave feminist art, we'll see that an overwhelming majority of canonized artists of this movement are cisgendered, Caucasian, conventionally attractive women who often use their bodies in their work. Hannah Wilke, for example, was largely derided by the feminist community until she started dying. And it wasn't until then that she got cancer and continued to photograph her ravaged body that she was vindicated by her feminist peers. Fast forward to today, and we have social media networks that amplify both performative narcissism and scopophilia. What should we make of the overwhelming popularity of of voluntary self-sexualization of the female artist amplified by social media? Is that even a category? I'm thinking about artists such as Bunny Rogers, who I previously spoke about, or even Amalia Ullman, who actually Rhizome archived her Instagram as a sort of practice. Further, what are the implications of using social media as an artistic medium? How does this confuse the reception of these practices as art? How are these issues complicated and expanded by the necessity of the artist's use of social media? If these women can't help their attractiveness, should they be expected to not capitalize upon bodily characteristics that are valued by a patriarchal society? Can voluntary self-sexualization even be considered an actual category, given that absolutely everything can be sexualized? Remember 4chan's edict that no matter what it is, it's somebody's fetish. No exceptions. In light of this, can we ascribe a set of ethics dealing with artwork that sexualizes the female body? How can we avoid calling out artists for bad feminism while fostering a community discussion about self-representation? Yeah, okay. So this is back on the train tracks here. If the boom of interest in so-called post-internet practices circa 2011 saw increased attention paid to the relationship between the distinct spaces online and in real life, artists and cultural practitioners have most recently increasingly done away with this binary distinction and focused on the inverse, the blurred indistinction between the two. While there's still an obvious distinction between the real and the virtual that we can intuit, one being accessed through a computer and the other the biophysical, the intertwined nature of these experiences has come to define our daily life. We can begin to understand this by acknowledging that information is not as material as it is commonly mistaken to be. Rather, as argued in Tiziana Terranova's Network Culture, Politics for the Information Age, information is a volatile commodity dependent on the physical form of the servers, wires, and cables that it inhabits. She writes, "The modern concept of information is explicitly subordinated to the technical demands of communication engineering, and more specifically, to the problems of the line or channel." I would also argue that the geopoliticization of information refutes such claims of immateriality. As in the very valuable information stored on the servers of WikiLeaks at Pionen Data Center in Stockholm, which I think is actually in a mountain and looks like a sci-fi lair and used to be a bunker. Information is a commodity that can be stolen or protected from government interests, depending on its geolocation. The ability to protect data via governmental autonomy from other governments' interests has given rise to micronations such as the Principality of Sealand, which is essentially a World War II sea fort off the coast of England in the North Sea. So that's a country. Further, anyone who's filled out a customer service questionnaire knows that experience can be quantified as data and is often collected, bought, traded, and used by corporations, both online and off, to further influence biophysical experiences. For example, if I write morning sickness in GChat when I'm complaining to a friend or something, or conduct a web search for missed period, Google will know that I'm likely in my first trimester of pregnancy. That's the "where is my period" slide. No period jokes, guys. Once Google becomes apprised of this knowledge, it will tailor web advertisements targeting expectant mothers. Should you click on an advertisement for a baby registry at Macy's, for example, Google will make money off of that e-commerce click-through. And then your brother will buy you that expensive video baby monitor you always wanted. And this becomes the main way that you look at your child at night. And it might be the first machine that your child ever interacts with. The now defunct artist duo H3D, Daniel Keller and Nick Cosmos, has long considered the role of corporate interest in the creation of mass-produced objects in interior architecture. Their spring 2011 exhibition, Exotic Options, at T293 in Naples, debuted a series of sculptures that are actually sneeze guards. Don't feel bad if you don't know what a sneeze guard is. I didn't know what it was either. It is a glass plane that protects food, usually a buffet, from the pesky snot of its onlookers. The sneeze guard is, in essence, a form of risk-mediating architecture. If you own a restaurant with a buffet and don't install sneeze guards, and something falls into a vat of food, you will lose that investment from having to replace that food, hence the risk mediation. H3D's sneeze guards come equipped with camouflage semi-distracting privacy film, which is a low-cost plastic mesh film that allows a person to peer out from inside of a bus, for example, but remain invisible to outside onlookers. These semi-distracting privacy films are also commonly printed upon with large-scale advertisements. Within H3D's Exotic Options, these sneeze guards are printed with camouflage patterns rather than advertisements. This camouflage seems to speak to a desire to disappear in public, particularly amidst a time of heightened corporate control over the body via data-driven public architecture. This sculpture is not a sneeze guard, but an ATM partition, another form of crowd-herding, risk-mediating architecture. In this case, the partitions protect big customers from onlookers stealing their PIN and potentially defrauding them and potentially defrauding the bank. Most importantly, H3D has located artistic practice as a reflection of everyday life, as something that has come into contact with corporate. The artist Hito Steyrl has written extensively of the commingling between the corporate and the artistic, and online and offline space. In her essay, Too Much World, Is the Internet Dead?, published in e-flux journal, she writes, oops. But here's the ultimate consequence of the internet moving offline. If images can be shared and circulated, why can't everything else be too? If data moves across screens, so can its material incarnations move across shop windows and other enclosures. If copyright can be dodged and called into question, why can't private property? If one can share a restaurant dish JPEG on Facebook, why not the real meal? Why not apply fair use to space, parks, and swimming pools? Shiro's 2014 video Liquidity, Inc. tackles the transformative nature between the virtual and the real head-on. It features Jacob Wood, a former Lehman Brothers analyst who is laid off during the dot-com bust and becomes a free-floating agent, eventually a performance-obsessed mixed martial arts fighter. The video also riffs on liquid aesthetics in a literal sense to include computer-generated imagery of waves and water, as well as the metaphoric liquidity of assets, and assets' ability to transform into cash. Tellingly, the ink in Liquidity, Inc. speaks to another form of transformation, specifically to the term incorporation. The term incorporate describes both the processes of assuming bodily form as well as a company becoming a legal entity, which often has legal rights as a human being. Consider the summer 2014 ruling that the arts and crafts purveyor Hobby Lobby has religious rights and is thus allowed to refuse to compensate its employees with health insurance that could possibly cover abortions. According to Oxford American Dictionary's website, incorporation entails the act of uniting several persons into one fiction called a corporation in order that they may be no longer responsible for their actions. That is the real definition. The term's etymological roots further evince its function to describe the liquidity and changing states of matter that Steil focuses on here. Incorporation coming from the Latin incorporat, meaning embodied, and the Latin corporare, meaning to form into a body. If a corporation can be considered a person, why can't information be considered, again, material? Here again is Terra Nova on information and its abnormal physical properties. It is the ease of copying, it has been argued, that makes of information such shifty and yet valuable, makes it as such a shifty and valuable commodity. We know that information can be sold and bought, and that a good deal of the world economy is driven by an emphasis on the informational content of specific commodities. And we are also aware that information itself can be valuable when it is used, for example, to make a profit on the stock market. We know that anybody is always potentially an information source or even an information storage device, and that science suggests that information constitutes the very basis of our biological existence, inasmuch as we are told we contain information that can be decoded within our very cells. In all these cases, information emerges as a content, as some kind of thing or object, but one that possesses abnormal properties such as the ease of copying and propagation, intangibility, volatility, etc., that contemporary technological developments have exacerbated and amplified. Terra Nova importantly expounds here on the abnormality of information that sometimes qualifies it as an abstraction. This concept of the abstraction of states and the confusion or power it begets seems symptomatic of both common power structure dynamics and also how we relate to the world. German media theorist Friedrich Kittler argued that it was with telegraphy that information, no longer simply a speech act, was abstracted as a massless flow for the first time, and it was pointed out by American information theorist Claude E. Shannon in 1948 that it is the signal or information that we seek amid such states of noise. As we learned earlier, the conflation of the corporation as person is a further political abstraction that gains power from its lack of responsibility. But this is not meant to be simply cynical. Rather, it's in the face of such noise that it seems paramount to recognize the powers of conflation and clairvoyance in order to protect the autonomy of our own bodies and information. Thanks.
Okay, guys, questions? I had a question. I mean, it seems what was interesting about, I think, maybe all three of your presentations, maybe, or maybe 2.5 of the presentations, was the presence of sex, right? And of course, we can talk about sex in the context of the internet as something like as having to do with maybe politics of proximity in the internet, and distance, and bringing people closer to each other. But then, what I kept thinking about, especially in Karen, in your World of Warcraft example, was I kept thinking of what Alex was saying about this tendency to expect a liberation of maybe like libidinal forces or this kind of free expression of desires on the internet, but then suddenly you find that it is actually just like mouth-breathing teenagers wanting to look at asses, or you find that actually what is liberated are actually the most standard kind of normative forms of behavior, right? So the sexual desire, like the kind of crazy, insane imagination, like the insane kind of sex that will be liberated by the internet, actually turns out to be just really like some teenage shit, right? So it immediately you have this kind of feedback loop, right? You see a kind of feedback loop, or a kind of a restoration of really the same order that was there before. I wonder if you had any thoughts on this.
Well, with Angela, I think it's really interesting because she was expecting to find a lot of people who were actually teenage boys playing this game, and it was a much more wider array. It was just largely male. So, like, obviously she didn't find a lot of diversity in terms of gender, but she found diversity in terms of, like, occupation, class, etc. But, yeah, I think that in a way that, like, sometimes these role-playing games are a way in which, like, you can say something that you're not allowed to say anywhere else. And there's a beauty to that, but there's also something that's, like, obviously very violent about it, too. And, yeah, I don't know. I guess I've never really experienced this myself, that I felt like I needed to do that. But I don't know.
I mean, it reminds me of actually how a lot of times these kind of new norms that we find online are actually, like, they appear to be very old or even like conservative norms, but they're actually something completely different. I mean, I'm thinking of a friend's daughter who's getting into her teens, who has a doll, who's really into this doll, and you think that she's a bit old to be playing with dolls, but actually it turns out that this doll is actually an avatar. You know, the doll is actually there to be posed and presented on Instagram, and right, so it looks like something, but it is actually it's actually something completely different. Yeah.
I just was watching these videos of these, like, goth girls making these tribute videos to Evanescence, and I'm pretty sure were trolling. Like, they were trying to be, like, really cute teenage girls that were, like, obviously, like, you know, secondhand embarrassment videos that were made to, like, incite people, judging them, and, you know, get a lot of views, and they probably made a little money off of YouTube from it. But I'm pretty sure that they're fake. And these girls are, like, 11 or 12, and the level of trolling present in this video is, like, absolutely amazing to me, because I wasn't doing that when I was 12. I was like, I don't even know what I was doing when I was 12. It was like, yeah, I wasn't an actual adult person who could even probably understand the concept of trolling. I figured that out when I was like last year. But
So you were mentioning the word bottleneck came up a couple of times, and one of the things, even though you were saying that we should need to forget Deleuze, it seems like that term comes out quite a bit as a Deleuzian critique of Lacan, right? You know, Deleuze critiqued the fact that with Lacan everything had to go through the bottleneck of the signifier, and so so Deleuze opens up a whole realm of things that don't submit to the signifier, right? And so I'm wondering if you could possibly forgetting Deleuze, and maybe explain how might you map this Deleuzian concept onto, which it seems is what you're doing. You're saying, well, the internet itself is a bottleneck, and we have to open up, you know, our world of thought to other realms, right? So how can you sort of still maintain Deleuze, or how would you actually sort of think about Deleuze in that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the idea of the bottleneck becomes more metaphorical if we're talking about, you know, a distributed network. Yeah, I guess, you know, for me it has to do with trying to think beyond this idea that distributed networks are, you know, kind of like the ultimate trump card or the ultimate get-out-jail-free card or something. And I mean, I would even, you know, like I think the ad hoc networking stuff and the mesh network stuff that Zach talked about at the very end is super interesting. It's kind of like the unfulfilled killer app or something. But I want to also propose that even in that world, we'd have to want to also have a theory of organization and a theory of management, right? And that's the jump that I think has to be made.
Something that this was reminding me of when you were talking about it was something that Reza Negarestani has been lecturing about in the past I don't know, year or two, which is yeah, that too, also the human centipede, yeah, but he was been talking about new Confucianism and a kind of almost if I'm understanding it correctly, a kind of update in the notion of bureaucracy, where bureaucracy is. I was thinking of this when you were mentioning the tree, because the tree is actually isn't it a kind of inverted pyramid structure? And in the same way, bureaucracy is known to be a kind of nightmare of a kind of nightmarish, dysfunctional network of management. It's actually what institutions are made out of.
I just want to push back on this question a little bit because there's like a once removal of forgetting and like theoretical name placeholder and bring up a particularly popular internet strategy and have you explain it to me like I'm 5.
Okay, what's the strategy?
Oh no, that's it. Explain it to me like I'm 5. It's like an actual, like it's a thing on Reddit. Like explain it to me like I'm 5.
Explain the internet?
No. This question, because I think that like what you're saying is like really interesting. But I think the like level of like once removals from like all of these different like forgetting, etc. is just I got kind of lost, and I wish that I could maybe just make that a little bit more of an accessible question and answer.
Yeah. Do you want him to start or me to start?
Alex, you can start.
I don't know. I mean, I think that what I was trying to get at was a kind of like legacy of what it means to be political, what it means to be progressive, what it means to be resistive, and I think that there are a lot of trends that we could extract from the 20th century, right? Like. And particularly accelerated, I think, in the 1960s, where, you have cellular forms and network-based metaphors. Sometimes they're very real, right? Like, so like in, the notion that that the problem with the state is not per se that it's unjust or something, but that it's shaped like a pyramid, or that it's shaped like a tower, or that it's shaped like a citadel, right? So we can even connect back to your point just now about, maybe we've fetishized form in a way, right? And maybe we have to ask, like, well, is the problem with a citadel or a tower that it's vertical, or is the problem that it is fascist or something, right? And those two things could be totally different. So, like, I'm against fascism, but I'm not necessarily against verticality unless there's a reason for it. I guess that's the only point I was wanting to make. And I think a 5-year-old could have understood that.
Any final questions?
I could say something about form. Just I go back to the dildo because maybe instead of trees or rhizomes, it's interesting to think about the dildo. And I think with Preciado, I mean that's really kind of the point of the dildo is that it's this it's a formal way of thinking about the way of constructing power dynamics within contrasexuality. And I mean I will say that that's not completely resolved with how I'm working through this, and actually kind of me bringing together the idea of the contra-internet and contrasexuality was kind of by accident, but it was just a very kind of productive, almost intuitive accident that I just decided to follow and experiment with. And I really like this idea of the dildo because it's both about exteriority, but then also the fact that the body itself can be understood through the composition of dildo. So that exercise where you draw a dildo on your arm, that's partially about unearthing certain kinds of tissues to actually construct penises during certain sex change operations. So Preciado says, yes, you can turn the whole body into this dildo-scape of contrasexuality, but your body actually materially is composed of like at least 6 dildos in the way that like this, So I don't know, there's something that's incredibly productive about that for me because it does attach things like, it takes sex very seriously, like all good queer theory should do. And yeah, I don't know, I'm just kind of putting that out there as a provocation. I'm really taken by that form of the dildo, and I'm trying to, think through it in relation to the stuff on networks, but, I'm not fully there with it. Yeah.
Yeah, this was actually the exception to sex becoming completely normative and almost, like mind-numbingly boring.
Yeah, and another thing that's really, I think, powerful about contrasexuality is that there's a point, I mean, that whole manifesto hasn't been translated into English, it's in Spanish, but there's a point in that manifesto where Preciado says, not transgender, contragender, and I think this like goes to some of the opacity stuff that I've worked on that I know Alex is interested in, that there's kind of a push against, by engaging in a certain militant way with sexuality, you're pushing against certain norms of identification that, of course, the internet is all wrapped up in. And one way I would think about this is maybe through the real name policy around Facebook and thinking about the expansion of the different ways you can identify your gender, right? Where Facebook has really dramatically expanded this, and is that right a progressive gesture on the behalf of Facebook, or is it about more precisely identifying so you can be more finely tracked? And I think the Preciado notion of contrasexuality would definitely fall on the kind of refusal of engaging in that kind of identificatory logic. And a friend of mine, Jacob Gabri, has taken up Judith Butler's idea of compulsive heterosexuality and started talking about this as compulsive identification, within these networks. Yeah.
Questions from the audience? Should we have a drink? Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming.